When I reached for the door handle of my own home, my son Donovan slammed it shut from the inside. The deadbolt clicked with finality as December wind cut through my thin sweater like razor blades. Through the frosted glass, I could see his silhouette, arms crossed, unmoved by my shivering. "Stop complaining. You'll survive," he called through the door, his voice sharp with contempt. That moment shattered something between us that I thought could never break. But what happened next changed everything. Not just for our family, but for everyone who thought they knew who I really was. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The porch light flickered weakly above me, casting long shadows across the snow-covered steps. My breath came in visible puffs, each exhale a reminder that the temperature was dropping fast. I pressed my palm against the door, feeling the warmth from inside seep through the wood, so close yet impossibly far away. "Donovan," I called, keeping my voice steady despite the cold seeping into my bones. "Please, son. It's below freezing." His laughter echoed from inside, hollow and cruel. "Maybe you should have thought about that before embarrassing me in front of Celia's parents." I closed my eyes, remembering the dinner from hell just hours earlier. His girlfriend's wealthy family, their crystal glasses and silver cutlery, their polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes when they looked at me. I had worn my best shirt, the one I'd pressed carefully that morning, but it still carried the faint scent of sawdust from the workshop where I spent my days. The cold bit deeper. My fingers were going numb, but I flexed them, remembering other hands that had once depended on my steadiness, hands that had trusted me when everything else failed. Through the window, I could see Donovan moving around the living room, deliberately ignoring my presence. At 28, he had grown into everything I wasn't. Polished, educated, successful in ways that mattered to people like Celia's family. His apartment in the city cost more than I made in 6 months, but when his lease fell through last month, he'd moved back in temporarily. Temporarily had become my daily humiliation. "You made us look like fools," he had said during the car ride home from dinner, talking about your old Navy stories like anyone cares. "These people deal in millions, not your small-town hero fantasies." Navy stories, as if 23 years of service were bedtime tales told to impress strangers. I pulled my jacket tighter, though it did little good. The wind was picking up, and snow was beginning to fall in earnest now. Each flake stung my cheeks like tiny accusations. My truck sat in the driveway, keys inside the house with everything else that belonged to me. Everything except the chain around my neck, hidden beneath my shirt, where Eleanor's wedding ring rested against my chest. The neighbors' windows glowed warm and golden. Mrs. Chen next door had her curtains drawn, probably watching the evening news. The Kowalskis across the street had their Christmas lights up already, twinkling red and green against the white landscape. Normal families and normal homes, where sons didn't lock their fathers out to prove a point. I sank down onto the porch steps, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans immediately. The metal railing bit into my back, but I needed something solid to lean against. My workshop keys jingled in my pocket, the only keys I still carried. At least there was a space heater out there, if I could make it across the yard without collapsing. But something kept me planted on those steps. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the stubborn hope that my son would remember who raised him, who taught him to ride a bike, who worked double shifts to pay for his college, who held him when nightmares came after his mother died. The wind howled louder, and I pulled my knees up, trying to conserve what warmth I had left. Above me, stars appeared between racing clouds, distant and cold as the space growing between my son and me. Inside the house, a light went out, then another. Donovan was going to bed, leaving me here in the December night, testing whether his old man really would survive. I closed my eyes and felt Eleanor's ring warm against my skin. "I kept him safe for you," I whispered into the wind, "but I don't know how to keep him human." The space heater in my workshop hummed to life, casting an orange glow across tools hanging on pegboard walls. I sat hunched over my workbench, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee brewed on the hot plate I kept for long nights. The numbness was leaving my hands, replaced by the sharp sting of returning circulation. Through the workshop window, I could see the house where I'd raised Donovan alone after Eleanor passed. The same house where I'd taught him to change a tire in this very driveway. Where we'd built a treehouse that still stood in the backyard oak. Now it felt like foreign territory, occupied by a stranger wearing my son's face. My reflection caught in the window glass. 68 years had carved deep lines around my eyes, turned my hair silver white, bent my shoulders forward from decades of leaning over engines and equipment. I looked like what I was, a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life. But Donovan saw something else when he looked at me. He saw embarrassment. The dinner replay wouldn't leave my mind. Celia's father discussing his hedge fund acquisitions while her mother talked about their winter home in Aspen. They'd been polite enough, asking about my little business with the kind of smile people give children showing off crayon drawings. "And what exactly do you restore?" Celia's mother had asked. Fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Military vehicles, mainly," I'd answered. "Jeeps, transport trucks. Some private collectors, some museums." Donovan's jaw had tightened. "It's more of a hobby, really. A hobby. 30 years of bringing history back to life. Of preserving the machines that carried our brothers through war zones, reduced to an old man's pastime." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to Donovan's contact. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I say? That his father was sitting in a cold workshop because his own son couldn't bear to be associated with him? That the man who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities was now treated like an inconvenience? Instead, I set the phone down and picked up a wrench. The 1,943 Willys Jeep in front of me needed its carburetor adjusted. Work was simpler than family. Machines were honest. When something was broken, you could see it, fix it, make it whole again. The metal was cold under my hands, but familiar. I'd been restoring this particular Jeep for 6 months, returning it to the same specifications it had when it rolled off the assembly line in Toledo. Every bolt, every wire, every piece of rubber, authentic to the period. "Why do you care so much about old junk?" Donovan had asked once, years ago. I'd tried to explain. These weren't just machines. They were vessels of memory, carriers of stories about ordinary men who'd done extraordinary things. But he'd already moved on, scrolling through his phone, uninterested in his father's passion. Now, as I worked in the dim light, I understood something I hadn't before. The cold hadn't just been about temperature. It had been about making me disappear, about erasing the parts of himself that Donovan found inconvenient. But some things, once built, don't break easily. Some men, once forged, don't bend. The workshop door rattled in the wind, and I glanced toward the house. Donovan's bedroom light was still on. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. Maybe somewhere inside that polished exterior, the boy who used to hand me tools and ask endless questions was still there, wondering if he'd gone too far. I turned back to the Jeep and continued working, the steady rhythm of repair drowning out the wind and the ache in my chest. The photograph was yellowed at the edges, tucked between the pages of my old Navy manual where I'd kept it for 34 years. Eleanor in her wedding dress, me in my dress blues, both of us impossibly young and certain the world would be kind to people who loved each other as much as we did. I set it carefully on the workbench, next to the coffee that had long since gone cold. The workshop was warming up, but memories have their own temperature, and these ran cold as the December night outside. Eleanor had been gone 12 years now. Cancer took her slowly, giving us time to say goodbye, but not enough time for anything else. She'd made me promise to take care of Donovan, to help him become the man she knew he could be. I'd kept that promise, or thought I had, until tonight showed me how spectacularly I'd failed. "He's not like us, Ray," she'd whispered during one of her last good days. "He needs different things. Don't let your pride get in the way of his dreams." I'd nodded, held her hand, promised I'd bend whatever needed bending. What I hadn't understood then was how much bending would be required, or how little of myself would be left afterward. After the funeral, Donovan threw himself into his studies with a desperation that worried me. Harvard MBA, internships at firms whose names I couldn't pronounce, a world that spoke in acronyms and algorithms. I'd supported it all. working extra contracts to pay for his suits, his apartment deposits, his networking dinners. The irony wasn't lost on me. My Navy pension and the restoration business had funded his transformation into someone who was ashamed of both. I picked up another photo from the manual's pages. This one showed me standing beside a damaged Humvee in Kuwait. 1991. I was 45 then. A chief petty officer with grease under my nails and sand in everything I owned. That Humvee had taken an IED hit. Its crew wounded but alive because the vehicle held together long enough to get them to safety. I'd spent 3 days rebuilding that engine under hostile fire, working by flashlight while mortars fell in the distance. When it finally turned over, the sound was like a prayer answered. That Humvee carried wounded Marines to the field hospital, then returned to service for 6 more months. The kid who'd helped me that day, passing tools and holding lights, had been named Torres. 19 years old, scared senseless, but steady when it mattered. He'd looked at me like I was performing miracles instead of just doing my job. "How do you make dead things run again, Chief?" he'd asked. "Same way you fix anything broken," I'd told him. "You figure out what it's supposed to do. Then you make it do that." Simple advice that had served me well for decades. But Donovan wasn't a machine with a manual and spare parts. He was Eleanor's boy, complicated and brilliant, and apparently convinced that his father was the wrong kind of man. I tried to bridge our worlds, attended his graduation, wearing my best suit and standing proud when they called his name. Visited his office once, marveling at the view from the 32nd floor while he explained derivatives and market structures in language that sounded like a foreign tongue. But every gesture I'd made to enter his world only seemed to highlight how I didn't belong there. My handshake was too firm, my shoes too practical, my questions too simple for the complexity he navigated daily. The workshop grew quiet except for the heater's steady hum. Outside, snow continued to fall, each flake catching the light like tiny stars descending. Eleanor would have loved this snow. She'd have made hot chocolate and pulled me away from whatever project consumed me, insisting we stand on the porch and watch the world turn white. "He'll come around," she'd have said about tonight. "He's hurt and he's scared, but he's still our boy." I touched her ring through my shirt, feeling its familiar weight. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just another broken thing that needed the right tools and enough patience to fix. But looking at that dark house, at the son who'd chosen cold indifference over warm forgiveness, I wondered if some things broke too completely to ever run again. The confrontation came at 7 a.m. sharp, while I was brewing coffee in the workshop. Donovan stood in the doorway, expensive overcoat unbuttoned, Starbucks cup steaming in his manicured hand. His eyes were red-rimmed. Whether from sleeplessness or guilt, I couldn't tell. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without invitation. I didn't look up from the carburetor I was cleaning. "Doors open." "This is ridiculous, Dad. You can't live in the workshop." "Seems I can. Did it most of last night." He moved closer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Everything about him was sharp edges and perfect lines, from his tailored suit to his precisely styled hair. He looked like he'd stepped out of one of those magazines Celia probably read. "Look, I'm sorry about last night, but you have to understand my position." I set down my tools and finally looked at him. "What position is that?" "Celia's family has connections. Her father could open doors for me that would take decades to open otherwise." His voice carried that tone he'd developed in business school, the one that made everything sound like a boardroom presentation. "These relationships are delicate. They require finesse. And I lack finesse. You told a 20-minute story about rebuilding a tank engine under fire. At dinner, while we were discussing investment portfolios. It was a Humvee, and those Marines were grateful it worked." He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding through his composure. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You live in the past, Dad. Your glory days are over. Nobody cares about your war stories or your rusty old trucks." The words hit like cold water, but I kept my expression neutral. "Is that what you think? That I'm some old fool chasing glory? I think you're a man who can't accept that the world moved on without him." I stood slowly, my joints protesting after the cold night. Donovan was taller than me now, had been since his 20s, but something in my movement made him step back. "You want to know what I was doing in Kuwait?" I asked quietly. "I was fixing things. Machines that kept people alive. Engines that brought our boys home. While you were in diapers, I was making sure other fathers got to see their children grow up. That was 30 years ago. And what have you fixed lately, son? What have you built with those soft hands and expensive education?" His face flushed. "I've built a career, a future, something you apparently want to sabotage. By existing, by embarrassing me in front of people who matter." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, Mrs. Chen was shoveling her driveway. The scrape of metal on concrete, rhythmic and purposeful. Normal sounds from a normal world where sons didn't measure their father's worth by their usefulness to strangers. "When your mother was dying," I said finally, "she made me promise to help you become the man you were meant to be. I thought that meant paying for school, supporting your dreams, staying out of your way when you outgrew this place." I paused, watching his face. I never thought it meant becoming invisible. "Dad," his voice softened slightly. "No, let me finish. You think I'm living in the past? Every vehicle I restore carries history forward. Every engine I rebuild honors the men who trusted their lives to these machines. That's not glory chasing, that's remembrance." He shook his head. "You're being dramatic, and you're being cruel." The word hung between us like an accusation. Donovan's jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of the boy who used to argue with me about bedtimes, who'd storm off to his room when he didn't get his way. "I work with people who control billions of dollars," he said coldly. "People who could change my entire trajectory with one phone call. If they see me as the son of some small-town mechanic who fixes junk in his garage, how do you think that affects my credibility? I wouldn't know. I've never been ashamed of honest work." He turned toward the door, then looked back. "Stay in the workshop if you want, but when Celia's family comes for Christmas dinner, you make yourself scarce. I won't have you ruining this opportunity with your need to be the center of attention." Center of attention? Don't pretend you don't know what you're doing. Every story, every comment, every time you try to insert yourself into conversations that are beyond your understanding. It's embarrassing. He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps sharp against the morning air. The workshop fell silent except for the heater's steady breath and the distant sound of Mrs. Chen's shovel. I sat back down, picked up the wrench, and returned to work. But my hands were shaking now, not from cold but from a rage that had nowhere to go. The boy I'd raised, the son Eleanor had loved, had just told me I was an embarrassment to the life he was trying to build. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and white under a pale winter sun, beautiful and cold, like the distance growing between us. 3 days passed before Celia appeared at the workshop door. She stood hesitant in the afternoon light, her designer coat incongruous against the backdrop of my practical space. Her expression was careful, neutral, the kind wealthy people wore when venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Hawkins, may I come in?" I gestured toward an old folding chair. "Coffee's fresh?" She perched on the edge of the seat, accepting the mug with hands that had never known calluses. For a moment, we sat in comfortable silence, the workshop warming around us. She studied the Willys Jeep, the organized tools, the photographs pinned to the bulletin board. "Donovan said you'd prefer to stay out here." "Donovan says a lot of things." I kept my voice neutral. "What brings you by, Celia?" She sipped her coffee, winced slightly at the strength. "I wanted to apologize for the other night. My parents can be intense about first impressions. No apology necessary, they were polite enough." "Were they?" She met my eyes directly, because I remember my mother making several comments about blue-collar work that weren't exactly kind. I studied her face, looking for the game underneath. Wealthy people rarely showed their cards this directly. People have opinions. Doesn't make them right or wrong. "My grandmother was a seamstress," she said quietly. "Worked in a factory until her fingers bled to put my mother through school. Mom spent so many years running from that, she forgot it was something to be proud of. And what do you think?" Celia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the photographs on my bulletin board. One showed me standing beside a restored 1944 Sherman tank. Others captured various vehicles in different stages of resurrection. "I think there's something beautiful about bringing dead things back to life," she said. "Donovan showed me photos of your work once. The detail, the authenticity. It's art." "He showed you?" A slight flush colored her cheeks. "Last year, before we got serious. He was proud then. Talked about how you could make any engine run, how you'd taught him to change his own oil and rotate his tires." She paused. "What changed?" I considered my words carefully. Celia seemed genuine, but she was still Donovan's girlfriend, still part of the world that valued appearance over substance. "Success sometimes makes people forget where they came from," I said finally. "Not always, but sometimes. He loves you, you know. He talks about you constantly, about how hard you worked after his mother died, how you sacrificed everything for his education." "Does he?" "But he's also terrified that he'll never be good enough for the life he wants. And sometimes, when people are scared, they push away the things that remind them of their fears." The observation hung in the air between us, more perceptive than I'd expected. I looked at her with new interest. Maybe there was more to Celia than designer clothes and trust fund privilege. "What does he fear exactly?" I asked. "That he's just a small-town kid pretending to belong in a world that would laugh him out if they knew the truth. That he's one mistake away from being back where he started." She set down her coffee cup, met my eyes. "He doesn't realize that's exactly what makes him valuable." "How so?" "Because he understands what real work looks like. Because he knows the weight of sacrifice. Because he was raised by someone who fixed what was broken instead of throwing it away." Her voice grew stronger. "My world is full of people who've never struggled for anything. They're beautiful and polished and completely hollow. Donovan isn't hollow. But he wants to be. He thinks he does. But I fell in love with the man who told me about learning to rebuild engines from his Navy veteran father. Not the man who apologizes for his family's honest work." I leaned back in my chair, studying this young woman who'd surprised me with her depth. "And what happens when his world and yours collide? When he has to choose?" Celia was quiet for a long time, staring at the Jeep as if it might have answers. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I hope he chooses to be himself instead of what he thinks others want him to be." After she left, I sat alone in the growing darkness, her words echoing in my mind. Maybe Donovan wasn't as lost as I'd feared. Maybe somewhere inside the polished exterior, Eleanor's boy was still fighting to surface. But wanting something and having the courage to claim it were different things entirely. And as Christmas approached, bringing Celia's family into our small world, I wondered if my son would find his backbone in time to save himself. The workshop grew cold as evening settled, but I didn't turn up the heat. Sometimes discomfort clarified thinking, and I had a lot of thinking to do. The pounding on the workshop door came at 10 p.m., sharp and insistent. I opened it to find Donovan, but not the composed businessman I'd grown accustomed to. His hair was disheveled, his tie loose, and his eyes carried a wildness I hadn't seen since his teenage years. "You've been talking to her." His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. "If you mean Celia, yes." She stopped by. He pushed past me into the workshop, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the concrete floor. "What did you tell her?" "We talked about coffee and old photographs. Nothing more. Don't lie to me." He spun around, pointing an accusing finger. "She's been different since then. Asking questions, making comments about authenticity, and staying true to yourself. That's your poison, isn't it?" I closed the door, noting how his hands shook slightly. "What poison?" "This whole honest work philosophy. This noble blue-collar bullshit you've been peddling my entire life. She's falling for it, just like I did when I was too young to know better. And what do you know now that you didn't then?" His laugh was bitter. "I know that honor doesn't pay the bills. That integrity won't get you invited to the right tables or introduced to the right people. That all your principles amount to nothing if you're standing outside looking in at the life you want." I moved to the workbench, keeping my hands busy with tools. When Donovan got like this, motion helped more than confrontation. Celia's father offered me a position yesterday. he continued, pacing now like a caged animal. Vice President of Strategic Development. 7 figures, plus bonuses. The kind of opportunity men kill for. Congratulations. It comes with conditions. I looked up from the wrench I was cleaning. Such as family matters. They need to know their executives come from the right background, associate with the right people. They're traditional that way. Traditional. I let the word hang in the air. They want to meet my father. The real version, not the sanitized dinner party version. They want to see where I come from, understand my foundations. Understanding crept through me like cold water. And you're worried about what they'll see. I'm worried about what you'll do. Whether you can keep your mouth shut about your glory days and your noble sacrifices long enough for me to secure my future. I set down the wrench, turned to face him fully. What exactly do you think I'll do, son? I think you'll embarrass me. I think you'll tell your war stories and show off your rusty trucks and make some speech about the dignity of honest work. And I think they'll smile politely and then decide I'm not the kind of man they want representing their interests. Because I'm not the kind of father they want their executives to have. Exactly. The word came out sharp, final, like a blade sliding home. We stared at each other across the workshop. 30 years of love and sacrifice reduced to this moment of brutal honesty. I saw Eleanor in his eyes, but also something she'd never carried. Shame. So what do you want from me? I asked quietly. I want you to disappear for a while. Take a vacation. Visit someone. I don't care what. But when they come to evaluate my suitability for this position, I need you gone. For how long? However long it takes. I nodded slowly, as if considering his request. And after? When you have the job, the position, the life you want? What then? Then we figure it out. But right now, I need you to choose between your pride and my future. The ultimatum hung between us like a challenge. I could see the boy who'd once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when his mother died, who'd hugged me so tight at his graduation I thought my ribs might crack. But I could also see the man who'd locked me out in the cold, who measured love by its convenience, who wanted his father to vanish rather than risk association. I raised you alone for 18 years, I said finally. Worked 2 jobs to pay for your education. Went without so you could have what you needed. I never asked you to be grateful, but I never expected you to be ashamed. I'm not ashamed. No. Then why does my existence threaten your success? He had no answer for that, or none he was willing to voice. Instead, he moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. I love you, Dad, but I love my future more. And if you really love me, you'll understand that sometimes love means letting go. After he left, I sat in the silence of the workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of machines and memories. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake a small surrender to gravity. I picked up the photograph of Eleanor, traced her face with one scarred finger. He wants me to let go, I whispered. But what if letting go means losing him forever? The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle mourned across the winter night. The sound of things moving on, leaving everything familiar behind. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was working on the Jeep's transmission. I almost didn't answer, expecting another uncomfortable conversation with Donovan. But the number was unfamiliar. Ray Hawkins? The voice was gravelly, aged, but carried an authority that made me straighten. Speaking. This is Admiral Jack Morrison, retired. I got your number from the Naval Heritage Foundation. I understand you restore military vehicles. I set down my wrench, curious. Yes, sir. Mostly World War II and Korea-era pieces. I'm calling about a project. Personal matter, not foundation business. You free for coffee this afternoon? We met at Murphy's Diner on Main Street. The kind of place that still served coffee in thick white mugs and didn't charge $5 for it. Admiral Morrison was shorter than his phone voice suggested. Probably mid-70s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. His handshake was firm, his bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes. Appreciate you meeting me on short notice, he said as we settled into a corner booth. I did some checking after I got your name. Impressive service record. 23 years. Chief Petty Officer. Multiple commendations. Just did my job, sir. Modest. I like that. He pulled out a folder, set it between us. I'm organizing a memorial dedication next month. Korean War veterans, specifically focused on the men who kept our equipment running under impossible conditions. Your name came up as someone who might understand the importance of mechanical authenticity. I opened the folder, found photographs of a 1,951 Dodge M37 truck, battle-scarred but salvageable. Beautiful machine, but belonged to Master Sergeant Cole Hendricks. Mechanic, like yourself. Kept an entire motor pool operational through 2 winters in sub-zero temperatures. Truck took shrapnel in '52, survived the war, ended up in a barn in Ohio. The Admiral's voice softened. Cole didn't make it home, but his truck did. I studied the photographs more carefully, noting the damage patterns, the missing components. Extensive work needed. 6 months, maybe more. That's why I'm here. The foundation has budget, but I need someone who understands that this isn't just restoration. It's resurrection. These machines carried our boys through hell, and they deserve to be remembered properly. We talked for 2 hours about metallurgy and authenticity, about the difference between restoration and renovation. The Admiral knew his equipment, asked smart questions, understood why original components mattered more than modern improvements. There's another reason I wanted to meet, he said as we finished our coffee. Word travels in military circles. I heard about your situation. I kept my expression neutral. What situation is that? Son having trouble reconciling his past with his ambitions. Tale as old as time, unfortunately. Seen it before. How did you? Mrs. Chen next door served 20 years in the Army Nurse Corps. She's concerned about you. Mentioned it to her nephew, who knows someone at the foundation. The Admiral's smile was slight but knowing. Small world, smaller military family. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. It's a private matter. Course it is. But private doesn't mean you have to handle it alone. He leaned back, studied me with those sharp eyes. You know what I learned in 40 years of naval service? Sometimes the best strategy isn't direct confrontation. Sometimes it's positioning yourself so well that the enemy defeats himself. My son isn't my enemy. No. But his shame is. And shame is a particularly vicious opponent because it makes people do things they know are wrong. He stood, left a 20 on the table. Think about the project. And think about this. Young men who run from their foundations usually find themselves standing on quicksand. After he left, I sat in the diner nursing cold coffee and thinking about positioning. The Admiral was right about shame being vicious. I'd watched it eat away at Donovan for months, turning him into someone Eleanor wouldn't recognize. But I'd also spent 23 years in the Navy, learning that the best battles were won before the shooting started. Intelligence, preparation, allies in the right places. That evening, I called the Admiral back and accepted the project. Not just for the money, though the Foundation's payment would be generous, but because sometimes the best way to remind people who you are is to show them what you can do. The Dodge M37 arrived on Friday, loaded onto a flatbed trailer that drew curious neighbors from their houses. Mrs. Chen appeared with fresh cookies and questions about the famous truck. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Ray Hawkins was working on something special. By Sunday, I had visitors, fellow veterans drawn by curiosity, neighbors who remembered their father's war stories, kids fascinated by the bullet holes in the cargo bed. The workshop became a gathering place, filled with stories and shared memories. And from his bedroom window, Donovan watched it all, his face unreadable behind the glass. The positioning had begun. The article appeared in the local paper on a Thursday morning. Local veteran restores hero's truck for memorial. It featured a photograph of me standing beside the Dodge M37, tools in hand, with Admiral Morrison explaining the significance of preserving military history. I didn't seek the attention, but Mrs. Chen had called her nephew at the paper, and he'd brought a photographer. What started as a simple human interest story became something larger when the reporter discovered my own service record and the scope of my restoration work. This isn't just about fixing old machines. The article quoted Admiral Morrison. Ray Hawkins represents a dying breed of craftsmen who understand that some things are worth preserving perfectly, not just adequately. By noon, my phone was ringing. Veterans from 3 counties calling to share their own stories, to ask about restoration services, to thank me for keeping history alive. The local VFW post invited me to speak at their next meeting. A museum in Albany inquired about my other projects. I was installing new wiring harnesses in the Dodge when Donovan appeared at the workshop door. His expression was tight, controlled, but I caught the tension in his shoulders. "Quite the celebrity," he said, holding up a copy of the paper. Not intentionally. He moved closer, studying the photograph. "Hero truck restoration. Admiral Morrison quoted extensively about your expertise and dedication. Very impressive." I continued working, letting him find his words. "Celia's father saw the article," he said finally. "Asked me why I never mentioned my father's military service or his specialized skills." "What did you tell him?" "That we don't discuss your work much." His voice was carefully neutral, but he seemed interested. Said he had no idea the expertise required for authentic military restoration. I set down my wire strippers, looked at him directly. "And that's a problem? It's complicated." He began pacing, the same restless energy I'd seen before. "They're coming for dinner Sunday. Family evaluation, remember? I need to control the narrative." "What narrative?" "The one where my father is a simple mechanic who fixes old junk in his garage, not some decorated veteran with specialized expertise that draws attention from admirals and newspapers." I blinked, confused. "You'd rather they think less of me?" "I'd rather they think what I tell them to think." His voice sharpened. "This hero worship complicates things. If they see you as some kind of distinguished craftsman, they'll expect you to act like one, to engage, to be present, to represent something. And you don't trust me to represent myself appropriately. I don't trust you to stay in your lane." The insult hit harder than intended, I think, because Donovan's face immediately showed regret. But the words were out, hanging between us like a challenge. "My lane," I repeated quietly. "Dad, you know what I meant. Do I?" I stood, facing him across the small space. "Because from where I sit, it sounds like you're embarrassed by success just as much as failure. Embarrassed by recognition just as much as obscurity. What exactly would make you proud to call me your father?" He had no answer, or none he was willing to voice. Instead, he picked up the newspaper, read the article again with visible frustration. "They describe your workshop as a museum-quality restoration facility, and your skills as irreplaceable expertise in military vehicle authentication. Do you understand how that changes expectations? Changes them how? They'll want to see it. They'll want tours, demonstrations, stories about your work. You'll become the focus instead of staying in the background where you belong." "Where I belong. Where we agreed you'd stay." The workshop fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. I studied my son's face, looking for some trace of the boy who'd once been proud of his father's abilities. "Donovan," I said finally, "what are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid you'll overshadow me in my own life." The admission came out raw, unguarded, and immediately he seemed to regret it. But there it was, the truth that had been driving his behavior for months. "Overshadow you? You don't understand. These people judge everything. If they think you're more impressive than me, if they see you as the real achievement in the family, then I become just the son riding his father's coattails." I stared at him, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "So you need me to be small, unremarkable, someone they can dismiss. I need you to be appropriate to the situation, which means invisible." He turned toward the door, then paused. "The article ends with Admiral Morrison saying you're a man who understands that true craftsmanship serves something larger than yourself. Very noble, very inspiring." His voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Just remember that this Sunday, something larger than yourself includes your son's future." After he left, I sat among the tools and machines that had defined my life, thinking about shadows and light, about sons who needed their fathers to dim themselves so they could shine brighter. Outside, neighbors walked past the workshop, some pausing to peer through the windows at the famous truck. Their attention felt strange, uncomfortable in ways I hadn't expected. But inside, working on a machine that had once carried heroes through war, I began to understand something Admiral Morrison had tried to tell me. Sometimes the best battles are won simply by being too substantial to ignore. The call came Saturday evening while I was putting finishing touches on the Dodge M37's engine compartment. Celia's voice was tight, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Mr. Hawkins, could you come to the house, please?" I found her sitting on my front porch steps, still in her work clothes but disheveled, her perfect composure cracked. Donovan was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my son?" "Gone. He left after." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "We had a fight. About tomorrow. About you. About everything." I sat beside her on the cold steps, noting how she wrapped her arms around herself against the December air. "What kind of fight?" "He wants me to tell my parents that you're ill. Nothing serious, just under the weather. That way you won't be able to join us for dinner, and they won't ask uncomfortable questions about your absence." The words hit like a physical blow. "And you said?" "I said I wouldn't lie about a man who's never been anything but kind to me." Her voice broke slightly. "He got angry, said I was choosing you over him, over our future together." "Where did he go?" "I don't know. He packed a bag, said he needed time to think before tomorrow." She looked at me with something like desperation. "Mr. Hawkins, I think I'm losing him." We sat in silence for a moment, watching our breath form clouds in the cold air. Across the street, the Kowalski's Christmas lights twinkled cheerfully, oblivious to the crisis unfolding in their quiet neighborhood. "Tell me about your parents," I said finally. "They're complicated. Successful, demanding, used to getting their way. But they're not monsters. They value achievement, respect hard work when they see it." She paused. "They just don't always recognize it in unfamiliar forms." "And what form would they recognize?" "Expertise, accomplishment, something that proves you're more than just." She stopped herself. "More than just what?" "More than just a mechanic who embarrasses their daughter's boyfriend." The honesty stung, but it was clean, sharp, surgical, better than the infected wound of pretense that had been growing between Donovan and me. "Celia, can I ask you something? Why does this matter to you? Why not just let him have his way?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Because I fell in love with a man who told me stories about learning integrity from his Navy veteran father, about growing up in a house where your word mattered more than your bank account." Her voice grew stronger. "If he erases that part of himself to impress my parents, then the man I love disappears, and I'll be left with someone who looks like him but doesn't have his heart." I understood then why Donovan was running. Not just from me, but from a choice that would define who he became. The man his mother raised or the man his ambitions demanded. "What do you want me to do tomorrow?" "I want you to be yourself. Completely, authentically yourself. Let my parents see what Donovan sees but won't admit, that he comes from something real, something worth being proud of. And if he doesn't come back, then at least I'll know who he really chose to be." She left shortly after, driving away in her sleek BMW while I stood in the driveway watching taillights disappear into the winter night. The house felt emptier than usual, filled with the echo of arguments and the weight of ultimatums. I went back to the workshop, but couldn't concentrate on the restoration work. Instead, I found myself cleaning tools that were already clean, organizing supplies that needed no organization. Nervous energy, the kind that comes before battles. At midnight, I made a decision that would have surprised Donovan. I called Admiral Morrison. "Ray, everything all right?" "Sir, I need to ask a favor." "A big one." "Name it." "Tomorrow's dinner is important, more important than I initially realized. I could use some backup." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "What kind of backup?" "The kind that reminds certain people why military service matters. Why restoration work isn't just a hobby. Why some things are worth preserving perfectly." "I'm listening." We talked for 30 minutes, developing what the Admiral called operational parameters. Not manipulation, but presentation. Not deception, but context. The kind of strategic positioning that let truth speak for itself. When we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not that Donovan would suddenly change, but that maybe, just maybe, he'd remember who he was before he decided who to become. I worked until dawn, putting final touches on the Dodge M37, making sure every detail was perfect. Because sometimes, when words fail, craftsmanship speaks louder than arguments. And tomorrow, everything would speak for itself. Sunday morning arrived crisp and bright. The kind of December day that made snow sparkle like diamonds across the neighborhood lawns. I stood in the workshop doorway with my coffee, watching the world wake up to what felt like the most important day of my life since Eleanor's funeral. The Dodge M37 sat complete behind me, its olive drab paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Every bolt authentic, every wire properly routed, every component restored to military specifications. Admiral Morrison had been right. It wasn't just restoration, it was resurrection. Donovan's BMW pulled into the driveway at 9 a.m. I watched him sit behind the wheel for several minutes before finally emerging, dressed in his expensive casual clothes but looking like he'd slept in them. His approach to the workshop was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Dad? Morning, son." He stood in the doorway, taking in the completed truck with something like awe. "You finished it. Last night. Admiral Morrison's picking it up Tuesday for the memorial ceremony. He searched for words. It's incredible. Like it just rolled off the factory floor." That was the point. We stood there awkwardly. Two men who'd shared a lifetime but couldn't find words for this moment. Finally, Donovan stepped closer, running his hand along the truck's fender. "Celia told you about our fight. She mentioned it. I was angry, said things I shouldn't have." He looked at me directly. "I never wanted you to be ill. I just wanted. You wanted me to disappear. I wanted control." The admission came quietly. I wanted to manage how her parents saw our family, our background. I thought if I could control the narrative, I could control the outcome. And now I think I've been an idiot. I sipped my coffee, letting him find his way through whatever he needed to say. "They're coming at 2, he continued. "Celia's parents. She's making her grandmother's pot roast recipe, trying to bridge our worlds somehow." He paused. "She asked me to invite you to join us." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her it was your house. You shouldn't need an invitation." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was closer than I'd expected. I nodded toward the truck. "Want to help me cover this? Snow's supposed to start this afternoon." We worked together in companionable silence, spreading the heavy tarp over the restored vehicle. Our movements fell into familiar rhythms from years of working side by side. Father teaching son, son learning father's methods. "Dad," Donovan said as we secured the final tie-down, "whatever happens today, I want you to know, I'm grateful. For everything. College support, the sacrifices you made." He straightened, met my eyes. "I've been ashamed of the wrong things." "What should you be ashamed of?" "How I've treated you. How I've let other people's opinions matter more than your feelings." He gestured toward the covered truck. "You built something beautiful here, something that matters, and I've been acting like it was an embarrassment instead of a gift." Before I could respond, Celia's car pulled into the driveway, followed by a silver Mercedes that looked like it cost more than my house. Game time. The Weatherbys emerged from their car like visiting dignitaries. Perfectly dressed, perfectly groomed, perfectly prepared to judge everything they encountered. Harold Weatherby was tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man accustomed to deference. Patricia Weatherby was elegant in that untouchable way wealthy women cultivated, her smile polite but evaluating. "Mom, Dad," Celia called out, bright and nervous. "Come meet Mr. Hawkins." I walked toward them, conscious of my work clothes but not apologetic for them. Harold's handshake was firm, measuring. Patricia's was brief, careful not to disturb her manicured nails. "Mr. Hawkins," Harold said, "we've heard quite a lot about you." "Likewise. Welcome to our neighborhood." Patricia glanced around, taking in the modest houses, The workshop. The general absence of pretension. How? Authentic. We like it. I replied simply. Donovan appeared at my shoulder, tension radiating from him like heat. Shall we go inside? Celia's been cooking all morning. As we walked toward the house, I caught sight of Mrs. Chen watching from her window, and the Kowalskis pausing their sidewalk, shoveling to observe the proceedings. The neighborhood was paying attention, sensing that something significant was happening at the Hawkins house. Inside, Celia had transformed my modest dining room into something approaching elegance. Candles, good china borrowed from somewhere, the smell of pot roast filling the air. She moved between kitchen and dining room with practiced grace, playing hostess in a home that wasn't hers but somehow felt like it should be. Beautiful home, Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was being polite rather than honest. Thank you. My wife decorated most of it. I haven't changed much since she passed. I'm sorry for your loss, Harold said, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine warmth. We settled around the table, navigating the careful choreography of conversation that comes when worlds collide. The Weatherbys asked polite questions about the neighborhood, the house, my retirement. I answered honestly but carefully, aware that every word was being weighed, measured, filed away for future reference. And outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, as if the weather itself was waiting to see how this story would end. The explosion came during dessert, triggered by the most innocent of questions. Mr. Hawkins, Patricia Weatherby said, delicately cutting her apple pie. Celia mentioned you do restoration work. Classic cars? Before I could answer, Donovan jumped in. Just a hobby, really. Dad fixes up old vehicles in his spare time. Actually, Celia said quietly, her voice carrying a warning tone Donovan missed. It's quite a bit more than that. The silence that followed felt charged, dangerous. I could see Donovan's jaw tighten, his carefully constructed evening beginning to crack. Harold leaned forward, interested. What kind of vehicles? Military mostly, I said simply. World War II, Korea-era equipment. Fascinating, Patricia murmured, though she didn't sound fascinated. Like a museum? More like a workshop, Donovan said quickly. Nothing too formal or... The doorbell cut him off, sharp and unexpected. We all froze, looking at each other across the candlelit table. Were you expecting someone? Harold asked. No, I said, rising from my chair. Excuse me. I opened the front door to find Admiral Morrison standing on my porch, snow dusting his shoulders, his expression grave but purposeful. Behind him stood two other men I didn't recognize, both carrying themselves with military bearing. Ray, the Admiral said, his voice carrying that command authority that made everyone within earshot straighten unconsciously. I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we have a situation. What kind of situation? The memorial committee moved up their timeline. We need the Dodge tomorrow morning, not Tuesday. There's a delegation flying in from D.C., including the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. He paused, glancing past me toward the dining room. I brought some colleagues to help with transport. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping as the dinner party moved toward the front door, drawn by curiosity and the unmistakable sound of authority. Admiral Morrison, I said, turning to make introductions. This is my son Donovan and his girlfriend Celia, and her parents, Harold and Patricia Weatherby. The Admiral's handshake was firm, his attention focused. Pleasure to meet you all. I apologize for the intrusion, but your father's work is somewhat time-sensitive. Work? Patricia asked, her tone sharpening. The restoration project. Master Sergeant Hendrix's truck. Admiral Morrison's voice carried the kind of respect that made people pay attention. Ray's been working on it for months. Museum-quality authentication, every component period correct. The kind of craftsmanship you rarely see anymore. Harold stepped forward, suddenly interested. You're a collector, Admiral? Retired Navy. 40 years. Now I work with the Naval Heritage Foundation, preserving military history. His eyes found mine. Ray here is one of the finest restoration craftsmen on the East Coast. Probably the finest. I felt Donovan's shock like a physical wave beside me. This wasn't the narrative he'd constructed, wasn't the small-scale hobby he'd described to his future in-laws. East Coast? Patricia's eyebrows rose. Oh yes. Ray's reputation extends well beyond this area. Museums from Virginia to Maine consult with him on authenticity questions. The Smithsonian called him last month about a Pacific Theater Jeep they're acquiring. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Donovan's stare, could sense the complete collapse of his carefully managed story. Perhaps, Admiral Morrison continued, you'd like to see the workshop? The Dodge M37 is quite remarkable. Took shrapnel in Korea, carried wounded Marines to safety, survived decades of neglect. Ray brought it back to life. I'd be fascinated, Harold said immediately. As would I, Patricia added. Her tone completely changed. We walked through the snow to the workshop, a strange procession of dinner party guests and military officials. Admiral Morrison switched on the lights, and I pulled back the tarp covering the Dodge M37. The gasps were audible. The truck sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Every detail perfect. The olive drab paint, the white star markings, the precisely restored canvas top. It looked like it could roll onto a battlefield or into a parade with equal authenticity. My God, Harold breathed, walking slowly around the vehicle. The attention to detail is extraordinary. Every bolt, every wire, every piece of rubber is period correct. Admiral Morrison explained. Ray rebuilt the engine from scattered parts, rewired the entire electrical system using 1,951 specification components. The paint alone required 3 months of research to match the original formula. Patricia was examining the interior. Her expression transformed from polite dismissal to genuine awe. The craftsmanship is museum quality. Better, said one of the Admiral's colleagues, stepping forward. I'm Dr. Martin Webb, curator of military history at the National Museum of World War II. I've worked with the finest restoration specialists in the country. Ray's work exceeds anything I've seen. Donovan stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed world collapse and rebuild itself in real time. The father he described as an embarrassing hobbyist was being celebrated by experts as a master craftsman. The historical significance alone, Dr. Webb continued, makes this vehicle invaluable. But the restoration work elevates it to art. Harold turned to me. His expression completely changed. Mr. Hawkins, how long have you been doing this level of work? 30 years, give or take. And your background? 23 years Navy. Chief Petty Officer. Mechanical specialization. Combat? Some. Desert Storm. Couple other deployments. Admiral Morrison stepped in. Ray's service record is exemplary, but his real gift is understanding that these machines are more than metal and rubber. They're memory keepers, storytellers. Each one represents countless men who trusted their lives to mechanical reliability. Patricia looked at Donovan, then back at me. And you do all this work yourself? In this workshop? Yes, ma'am. Remarkable. She walked to the pegboard wall where my tools hung in precise organization. The dedication required must be extraordinary. Wong, it's important work, I said simply. Harold was studying the photographs on my bulletin board, pausing at images of other restored vehicles, of me standing with various military officials, of ceremonies where my work had been featured. Mr. Hawkins, he said slowly, I believe I owe you an apology. For what? For assumptions. For failing to recognize expertise when I encountered it. He looked directly at Donovan. Your son described your work as a hobby. He undersold both the scope and the significance considerably. The words hit Donovan like physical blows. His face went white, then red, cycling through embarrassment, shame, and something approaching panic. He started, then stopped. Son, I said quietly, why don't you tell them about the time you helped me rebuild the transmission on the Sherman tank? You were 16, remembered every step. The olive branch hung in the air between us. Donovan could take it, could reclaim his connection to this work, to this legacy, or he could maintain his distance, his carefully constructed shame. For a moment, I thought he might take it. His eyes softened, and I saw a flash of the boy who'd once been proud to be my helper. But then his composure cracked completely. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," he said, his voice rising. "This performance. This need to be the center of attention, to overshadow everything else." The workshop fell silent. Admiral Morrison and Dr. Webb exchanged glances. The Weatherbys looked stunned. "Overshadow?" I asked quietly. "You couldn't just be a mechanic. You couldn't just fix old junk and stay in the background. You had to be special, had to be celebrated, had to make me look small by comparison." The words echoed in the workshop like gunshots. Patricia Weatherby's mouth fell open. Harold took a step back, as if witnessing something too private for strangers. "Donovan," Celia whispered, her voice horrified, but he was beyond stopping now. Months of resentment pouring out like poison from a lanced wound. "Do you know what it's like growing up as the son of a hero? Always being compared to someone who rebuilds history in his garage? Nothing I accomplish will ever matter because I'll always just be Ray Hawkins' boy, the one who isn't quite as impressive as his old man." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Admiral Morrison broke it, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that ended arguments. "Son," he said, and the word carried weight, "let me tell you something about heroes. Real ones don't try to be impressive. They just do what needs doing, when it needs doing, regardless of recognition." He looked directly at Donovan. "Your father spent months bringing that truck back to life, not for glory, but because Master Sergeant Hendricks deserved to be remembered properly. Because history matters. Because some things are worth preserving perfectly." Dr. Webb stepped forward. "In 30 years of museum work, I've met exactly 3 craftsmen capable of this level of authentic restoration. Your father is one of them. His reputation in military history circles is extraordinary." Harold Weatherby's voice was quiet but clear. "Mr. Hawkins, I want to apologize for my son-in-law's behavior, both now and apparently throughout this process." "Future son-in-law," Celia corrected, her voice hollow. "Maybe." Patricia was staring at Donovan with something approaching disgust. "Young man, I don't know what kind of upbringing you think you had, but where I come from, we don't speak to our fathers that way. Especially fathers who've earned the respect you just witnessed." The Admiral looked around the workshop one more time, his gaze lingering on the restored Dodge, on the organized tools, on the photographs of ceremonies and accomplishments. "Ray," he said, "we'll be back tomorrow morning for the truck. Thank you for your exceptional work, as always." As the military officials filed out, Harold Weatherby lingered. "Mr. Hawkins, I'd like to discuss commissioning some restoration work. I collect vintage aircraft, and I've been looking for someone with your level of expertise and attention to authenticity. I'd be honored to discuss it." He handed me his business card, then looked at Donovan. "Son, I don't know what game you've been playing, but you've been cheating yourself out of something remarkable." After they left, the workshop fell quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of Donovan's harsh breathing. "Well," I said finally, "I guess dinner's over." The workshop felt different in the morning light, charged with the electricity of truth finally spoken. I found Donovan there at sunrise, sitting on the old folding chair, staring at the covered Dodge M37 like it might have answers to questions he was only beginning to ask. "Couldn't sleep either?" I said, pouring coffee from the thermos I'd brought from the house. He shook his head, accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I keep replaying last night, over and over." "Any conclusions?" "That I'm exactly the kind of man Mom would be ashamed of." The admission hung heavy in the cold air. I pulled up another chair, sat facing my son across 30 years of love and disappointment. "Eleanor would be disappointed in your choices," I said carefully. "But she'd never stop loving you. Neither will I." "How can you say that after what I did, after what I said?" "Because being a father means loving the man you're becoming, not just the boy you were." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like it might hold absolution. "Celia left me. I figured as much. Packed her things while you were saying goodbye to the Admiral. Said she couldn't marry someone who was ashamed of his own family." His voice cracked. Said she fell in love with the man who was proud of his father, and that man apparently doesn't exist anymore. Does he? Donovan looked up, eyes red with exhaustion and something deeper. I don't know. I've been running from this place. From you. From everything that made me who I am for so long that I don't remember how to be proud of where I came from. Outside, Admiral Morrison's transport truck pulled into the driveway. Right on schedule. We sat in silence as they uncovered the Dodge M37, loaded it onto the trailer with the careful precision military equipment deserved. That truck, Donovan said, watching it disappear down the street. It's going to honor a man who died in service to his country. That's the idea. And you brought it back to life because it mattered, not because anyone would notice or thank you for it. Recognition's nice, but it's not why you do the work. He stood, walked to the pegboard where my tools hung in perfect order. I used to love this place. Used to think these tools were magic, the way you could make broken things run again. What changed? I got older, started believing that success meant moving away from anything that looked like work, smelled like grease, reminded me that I came from people who fixed things instead of owning them. He touched a wrench, lifted it from its hook. But last night, watching those men talk about your reputation, your expertise, I realized I've been ashamed of the wrong things, such as I've been ashamed of honest work, of craftsmanship, of the fact that my father can do things most men can't even comprehend, when I should have been ashamed of caring more about other people's opinions than my own family's feelings. I joined him at the tool wall, noting how naturally he'd picked up the wrench, how his hands remembered the weight and balance. Your mother used to say that dignity isn't something you inherit or buy. It's something you build, one choice at a time. I've made some terrible choices. Then make better ones. He replaced the wrench carefully, precisely, the way I'd taught him. The job offer from Celia's father. I turned it down this morning. Why? Because I realized that any position requiring me to hide my family isn't worth having. He looked at me directly. I'm sorry, Dad. For the lockout. For the dinner. For every cruel word and dismissive gesture. You deserved better from the son you raised. And what now? Now I figure out how to be the man Mom wanted me to be. The one who's proud of his foundation instead of running from it. We stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and memories that had shaped both our lives. Outside, Mrs. Chen was shoveling her walk again, and the Kowalskis were hanging fresh Christmas lights to replace the ones damaged by yesterday's snow. There's something else, Donovan said. Harold Weatherby called this morning. Still wants to commission restoration work, but he also offered me a position with his investment firm. Different role, focused on authentication and evaluation of collectible assets. Using your MBA and your knowledge of restoration work, bridging both worlds instead of choosing between them. He smiled slightly. Turns out having a father who's a master craftsman isn't a liability in the collectibles market. It's an advantage. I felt something ease in my chest. A tension I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. And Celia? Gone. Maybe for good. His voice carried pain but not bitterness. But she was right to leave. She deserved better than someone who was ashamed of his own story. Stories can be rewritten. Can they? Depends on whether you're brave enough to tell the truth from now on. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the commitment. Dad, would you teach me to restore something? Really teach me. Not just let me hand you tools? I looked around the workshop, considering projects that might suit a son learning to reclaim his heritage. There's a 1944 Ford GPW in the back corner. Jeep variant, needs complete overhaul. Good project for learning proper techniques. How long would it take? Done, right? 6 months, maybe more. I'd like that. I'd like to learn how to fix things properly instead of just throwing money at problems. As we walked toward the stored Jeep, I felt Eleanor's ring warm against my chest. Her boy was coming home. Not to the house we'd shared, but to the man we'd raised him to be. One condition, I said as we pulled the tarp off the Ford GPW. No shortcuts, no modern substitutes, no cutting corners because it's faster or easier. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Yes, sir. The words carried respect, not resentment. For the first time in months, My son was looking at me like a man worth learning from instead of a burden worth escaping. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the neighborhood in fresh white. Inside the workshop, surrounded by tools and history and the possibility of redemption, we began planning the restoration of more than just a vintage Jeep. Some things once broken can be fixed. Some relationships once damaged can be rebuilt stronger than before. And some sons, once lost, can find their way home to the fathers who never stopped believing in them. The clock on the workshop wall ticked steadily forward, marking not just time passing, but time beginning again. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and personal ambition? Let me know where you're watching from. And remember that sometimes the strongest foundations are the ones we're tempted to abandon.